There we go. Are we live now?
Yep.
People are joining. Yes, I can see people joining.
We'll give them a minute.
Sure.
Perfect. So we'll start now. So hello and welcome to our webinar on the supply side headwinds for home building with Robert Dietz, Chief Economist and Senior Vice President for Economics and Housing Policy for the National Association of Home Builders. My name is Jerica Logan, and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. If you require closed captioning, you will find a box at the bottom of the screen called CC. Click on the box and select Show Subtitles. This will allow you to see the subtitles during the presentation. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar in the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the presentation, and if we do not get to your question, we apologize. If you have any questions following the event, please feel free to email me at logan.433@osu.edu. There will be also a short survey at the end of the webinar. If you have any time, please provide your feedback. I'm now going to pass it over to our director, Harvey Miller.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's CURA seminar. This is part of CURA's regular series on issues and challenges facing the city and regions in Ohio and beyond. And we're developing a new set of events for spring 2022 on resilient communities. Stay tuned for more information as it develops. Go to cura.osu.edu to sign up for our monthly newsletter. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. That way you'll never miss any of the exciting events happening at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. This is also the kickoff event in our annual GeoWeek celebration and GIS Day this week at Ohio State, and go to geography.osu.edu for more information about this week's exciting events. So I now want to introduce Dr. Robert Dietz. He is Chief Economist and Senior Vice President for Economics and Housing Policy for the National Association of Home Builders, where his responsibilities include housing market analysis, economic forecasting and industry surveys, and housing policy research. He has published academic research on the benefits of homeownership, federal tax policy, and other housing issues, and has testified before Congress on real estate policy issues. He is often cited on housing and economic issues at the Wall Street Journal, CNBC, and other media sources. Prior to joining the NAHB in 2005, Robert worked as an economist for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, where he was the committee's real estate expert. Robert is a native of Dayton, Ohio, and earned a PhD in economics from The Ohio State University. And he was also a graduate research associate from 1999 to 2001 at CURA and its predecessor, the Urban and Regional Analysis Initiative. So we have determined that Robert was the first CURA GRA. So we're happy to have you back here at Ohio State, so to speak, and we look forward to your talk and the discussion afterwards. Please, Robert, take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey. Thank you, Jerica. It's really good to be able to join you. It's a little difficult to believe it's been almost 20 years since I was on campus as a graduate student. But if you're not familiar with my current employer, the National Association of Home Builders is a national trade association. We have about 140,000 members, builders, remodelers, land developers. And most large national trade associations have an economics or data science group. Ours dates back to the mid 80s, and currently we have about a dozen economists. We're organized into three groups. One group does survey research of the industry. Another group is forecasting and data analysis. And then we have a third group that does policy analysis. And we're kind of a little bit separate from the other parts of the trade association, which either are involved in DC lobbying or put on a national trade and exposition show. And so we like to think that we provide credible data analysis. And again, kind of going back to the introduction, I'm doing a lot of kind of the same kind of research work that I did at Ohio State, whether in the economics department or with URAI or what became Cura. So it was really kind of nice to be able to come and talk to you today about the state of the housing market. And housing really has gone through a lot of challenges over the last decade. Housing was a bright spot of 2020, and we're still facing some of the same challenges in the housing space, including a lack of inventory. And if Jerica, if you could give me share screen access, I will go ahead and share my my slide deck. There we go. Excellent. And so what I'm going to walk you through today, and I'm happy to take questions when we get to the end. I'm going to start off with some just background stuff that's focused on, it gives you a sense of the benchmark of where we have the overall state of the economy. And then I'm going to dive into some details that are specific to the supply side of housing. I think often in housing analysis, particularly in the media, we focus a lot on the demand side. And obviously, given our focus on the industry, builders, remodelers, land developers, we collect a lot of data and do a lot of analysis on the supply side. And the reason that we've had such substantial gains in home prices, up more than 30% over the last 18 months, as well as ongoing growth in rents, is frankly a housing deficit. And I'm going to give you some of the reasons behind that. Now, in terms of the overall kind of backdrop of where we see both the housing market and the state of the economy, clearly deployment of the vaccine is supporting economic growth in those areas where the vaccine has high take-up rates. The Delta wave appears to be easing, but some of the recent data do show a bit of flatlining, in fact, some growth in colder states. That's going to have an impact on the housing market as we go into 2022. Economic growth in 2021, best year since the mid 1980s, but we expect higher interest rates as we move forward, and that's going to have an impact on housing affordability. We do think growth is going to slow, and I'll give you kind of our GDP forecast. In terms of, this is the broader discussion of the supply chain issues, but building materials are really a key concern, and the lumber market in particular was the canary in the coal mine when it came to the construction industry, what the lumber market went through last year. And I'll give you some of the price data and some of the reasons that we saw such volatility in the cost of lumber. We're looking for, when the final data are in for 2021, single family construction, remodeling, and apartment construction all post pretty strong gains this year. We think a lot of those are going to slow as we get into 2022. And I think that's in contrast to some of the housing market optimists right now who kind of see the growth that we saw this year continuing to next year and 23, and I don't think that's going to happen. Housing affordability really is the primary reason for that, some of that slowing. And again, I'll give you some of the data that we track in terms of what we expect in terms of declines for housing affordability as we move forward. So we'll start off again with just a couple of macro slides, then we'll get into some of the supply side factors. GDP data, I believe most of you are familiar with this kind of presentation, but we had a disappointing data report for the third quarter. You can see that blue bar right before the red vertical line. It only came out a 2% growth rate. Our forecast model had it about a 4% growth rate. But if you look at the year by year, we're going to get above 5% GDP growth in 21 as the rebound and recovery from a very challenging 2020. You can still look at the second and third quarter data from last year and just see how historic it was in terms of the artificial nature of the downturn and the impacts that, of course, has had on real estate. But we think growth is going to slow going into the next 2 years. We don't have a recession on our forecast table, but that slowing growth is going to have an impact on real estate development as we move forward. And clearly the big discussion from a policy perspective in Washington right now is the state of inflation. We broadly agree, at least our forecast model broadly agrees with the Federal Reserve that a lot of these inflation pressures are transitory. There's been some for political reasons who think that transitory means temporary and quick. That's not going to happen, but we do think some of the inflation pressures are going to ease. And this is the core PCE measure of inflation. It's the Federal Reserve's preferred measure for setting monetary policy. Inflation was a little low before we went into 2020, below a 2% growth rate. And we do think it's going to be higher as we exit this transition period. But the big thing is that some of the supply chain issues are going to ease. In fact, I'm going to give you an example in terms of the lumber market of the kind of pattern I think the Fed expects to see for the broader inflation story. But nonetheless, the Federal Reserve is going to tighten monetary policy. For a housing-specific item right now, they announced a tapering or a reduction of those mortgage-backed security purchases they were making since the COVID crisis started. They were buying about $40 billion a month in Fannie and Freddie debt. That's keeping mortgage interest rates lower than they otherwise would have been. The tapering begins this month, and it's going to continue until they get down to no additional purchases of those mortgage-backed securities by the time we get to the middle of next year. And then by the second half of 2022, we believe the Federal Reserve is going to begin raising its target federal funds rate. And all of those factors are going to raise mortgage interest rates. And here on this slide, we've got at the back part of the slide our forecast for where we think mortgage rates are headed. We saw a little bit of a decline here at the start of 21, but we think we're headed to a little bit higher than a 4% average 30-year fixed rate mortgage as measured by Freddie Mac by the second half of 2023. And something to keep in mind in terms of trying to create analogies of what we think housing demand is going to do. Look back at the data on interest rates for 2018. Now, if you recall, in 2018, that's when the central bank was raising the Fed funds rate, and the result was that mortgage rates, again, looking at that red line, began to increase. In fact, we got up to a peak rate, and you can kind of see it was the highest rate for more than a decade, of about 4.9%. It was right below 5%. Well, it turns out that given home prices back then, a 5% 30-year fixed rate mortgage rate was enough to cause a housing soft patch of about 6 to 7 months. In other words, housing affordability conditions bit into the market and slowed things down considerably. We think that late 2018 period is a pretty good simulation or model for what we're going toward. And it's not going to require mortgage interest rates to get up to 5% this time. We think given the fact that home prices have increased so much over the last 18 months, that we really only need to get up to about a 4% 30-year fixed rate mortgage to really see some significant slowing in the housing market. So you can see our forecast both for the 10-year Treasury and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage as we move forward. Now, as I said, all the macro data is really kind of just kind of the backdrop for housing affordability. This is the NAHB, my team's housing opportunity index. Every group has got some kind of affordability measure. Some are better than others. I think ours is pretty good. It's got some flaws, particularly with respect to labor market data, but nonetheless, it's the percent of new and existing home sales that are affordable for a household right in the middle of the income distribution. So if you look at the left hand of the slide, it was almost at 80%. Well, clearly that's coming out of the price declines that we had with the Great Recession. So housing affordability was relatively high back then. Over the last decade, it's trended lower. That's in part due to underbuilding. And then you can see at the very end of the slide, it kind of takes a pretty significant step down to a level of 57. And the reason for that is the home price growth that we've experienced over the last year and a half. My concern is that will continue to trend lower. And in fact, as we get closer to a level of 50, which would be the first time that we've gotten to that level since the Great Recession itself, we'll have more investors in the market and fewer prospective homeowners. And that's going to represent a really significant challenge to housing affordability and frankly, the homeownership rate as we move forward over the next 2 to 3 years. So as I said before, the limits on housing affordability are really connected to the fact that we haven't built enough housing, both rental and owner occupied over the last decade. And so one of the things that my team has sort of struggled with over the last 5 to 6 years is trying to identify the reasons for this. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm very focused on the supply side. And not to be too cute about it, but we kind of categorize all of the different challenges that the residential construction industry faces. We call them the 5 L's. It's a lack of labor, it's a lack of lumber and building materials. That's the top challenge right now. A lack of building lots, because the land development market is a lot more challenging than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago. It's challenges in lending, and again, often in housing debate and housing analysis. When we talk about lending, we immediately think about mortgages. But here we're referring to lending as in the lending and capital access to builders and land developers. The market for financing residential construction firms is a lot different than it was 15 years ago. It's a lot more risk averse. The amount of capital that's available is smaller, and the result is that the lots, another one of those L's, has kind of been constrained in terms of the amount of financing available to develop those lots. And then the last one, laws and regulatory costs, and I'll give you some estimates of those. So let's dive into those. First, we'll start with labor. And I think one of the big changes coming out of 2020 is a big rise in the number of open, unfilled jobs. Now, there are a lot of different reasons for this. Some of this is childcare concerns, the schools, ongoing skills mismatches. But you can see the blue line here is the job openings rate. It comes from a great data set called the JOLTS data set that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has been operating for the last 2 decades. I know it's Janet Yellen's favorite macro data. Well, you can see the story here. That blue line really kind of shoots up here in 2021. And in fact, right now we have more than 10 million open jobs in the United States. Now, the red line is the unemployment rate. Again, you can see it spiking during the recession of 2020 due to essentially the shutdown of the U.S. economy during the spring. A pretty rapid decline. And in fact, right now, we're actually doing better than we forecasted. We've got less than a 5% unemployment rate. My concern is that, and it sounds like good news, of course, but as the broader unemployment rate goes below, say, 4% in the coming quarters, it's going to get harder and harder to recruit workers into sectors like residential construction. And the skilled labor shortage has been an issue in the construction industry for at least the last decade right now. Some demographic data that I think is worth noting. Some of this is just a demographic challenge in terms of some of the job openings, particularly in sectors like construction. Here we took BLS data. The starting point is the year 2000. And the blue line is essentially the incremental growth in the number of workers in the labor force who are 55 and older. Now, no big surprises here. We've got an aging population. The baby boomers were, until the millennials, the largest generational group. So that blue line is going up until we get to 2020, and I'll get to 2020 in a second. But it's the red line that I really want you to kind of take notice of, which is there was almost no growth from the year 2000 to the year 2019 in terms of the size of the labor force that was under 55. So sectors that tend to recruit younger workers, places like the military, transportation, construction, energy sector, it's been a growing challenge because that labor force essentially was not growing. Now, the 2020 data, you can see dips down. That's the decline in essentially the labor force participation rate that we experienced in 2020 due to COVID, due to some early retirements, due to health issues, and of course, due to childcare concerns. But even there, if you look at the slopes of those lines, you can see that the under 55 group was much more affected than the 55 and older in terms of the scale of decline. I think that really kind of puts the emphasis there on childcare. So I think there's a lot of good academic research that's going to come out over the coming years in terms of what the labor force went through as a result of COVID. But it does have an impact on housing because it limits the availability of construction workers. And here's how we measure that. This comes from the JOLTS data set. It's the job openings rate, or the count of jobs that are currently open just in the construction industry. Now, this is residential and non-residential combined on the slide. We can't break them out in the data set. But if you look at the red line, which is just the 12-month moving average, it's the smooth version of the monthly data, you can see it was actually going down in 2020. And the reason for that is the broader unemployment rate went up. Housing was a bright spot in 2020. Builders and remodelers already had a labor shortage, and they took advantage of all that other unemployment that we had in 2020, and they were able to hire workers. And just within the residential construction industry, over the last 18 months, we've added more than 110,000 workers in home building remodeling. So that was kind of a remarkable pickup. But then if you look at the data going into 2021, that line is going back up. The red line is increasing again. And what I think is going to happen, just based on our survey data, I've been doing a lot of traveling market to market over the last few months. I think we're going to see some of the challenges in the building material space begin to ease, and then labor is going to emerge once again as the top challenge in terms of being able to add additional housing supply for the residential construction industry. Now, I mentioned this a couple of times. A lot of this is connected to the labor force participation rate. It had been trending lower, and frankly, for men in particular, the labor force participation rate's been trending lower since the late 40s. Some of that is an aging population, of course. There's some other changes that have taken place. But if you look at what happened in 2020, a pretty strong decline there, a bit of a rebound, but it's been an incomplete rebound. And so whether it's for housing policy or job policy or just general economic growth, getting that labor force participation rate up is a key economic policy item going forward. So Economics 101, I told you we're short several 100,000 workers in the construction industry. Well, what's happening to wages? They're growing about twice as fast as the overall economy right now in the residential building space. And in fact, the most recent data shows about a 7% year-over-year gain in terms of construction wages. That, of course, is making it more expensive to build apartments and single-family homes, and then those higher costs have to be reflected into the marketplace. And we did some analysis. This is actually some new work that we just published a few weeks ago. This is kind of some background information on the residential construction labor market, but it's the number that's underlined here that I kind of want you to take away. I gave you the 330,000 or so job openings that are currently in the market. But right now, the construction industry, residential and non-residential, needs to be adding about 740,000 workers per year to account for industry growth, plus, and this is why we call these occupational openings, retirements or permanent worker exits. So this can include people moving from the construction industry and leaving it permanently and moving elsewhere. So that is a lot of ground to make up when it comes to the labor market in the construction industry. And it takes time to train people. We think training can take 3 to 4 months to get kind of basic skills. It probably takes about 18 months to really get someone up to carpentry, electrical work, plumbing, all the kind of the middle skills that we need in the construction industry. And then if you look at the very last item, I put some other data points on here, but the very last data point, some interesting dynamics in terms of the age of the labor force in the construction industry. We've got a decline in workers who are 25 to 54. We've got growth of workers who are older than 54. That's the aging of the existing skilled workforce. And then we've got some growth in the share of workers who are under age 25. And that's the recruitment effort. So you've got the growth at the kind of the two opposite ends of the age distribution of the labor force. But if you put that all together, we've got an ongoing challenge in terms of the skilled labor force. And if you ask builders, remodelers in high growth markets like Texas, where 3 of the 5 top home building markets are, they'll tell you that one of their top challenges absolutely is the labor sector. And I said that part of our team does survey data. We surveyed builders and asked them what were the occupations that were in tightest supply, that they had the largest shortages of: framing crews and various kinds of carpenters. So it's really kind of the wood product construction worker that's a top challenge. But just look at the set of occupations where at least half of home builders have indicated some shortage, up to a serious shortage, and includes painters, plumbers, drywall installers, electricians, roofers. I think we're going to see a real bipartisan effort, I hope, led by the Labor Department to really try to bring people in, working with community colleges, working with trade schools. There's kind of a virtuous circle that can be created where we can lift the labor force participation rate, train people as long as we invest the resources in them, create jobs, and then this will help us build housing, which will help us move in the right direction on housing affordability. The other challenge, I shouldn't say the other challenge, there's a lot of challenges with the labor market and the construction industry. But, part of the reason we have a labor shortage is that we don't do a very good job of recruiting from the full population. And what we find is that if you look at BLS data, only about 11% of the construction industry consists of women. This is moving in the right direction, but I think from a forecasting perspective, it's not going to move quickly. It's going to require cultural changes. It's going to require more investment in things like technology to attract different kinds of workers into construction. But this is something the industry really is trying to invest more in, of recruiting more women into the industry. You're going to have a skilled labor shortage if you're not effectively recruiting from half the population. And we do recognize that this is a challenge. The other factor is, and this goes back to what I was giving you the data in terms of residential building wages. In the long run, microeconomic theory says you can't have sustained growth in wages, which we're getting right now due to scarcity, unless you have a corresponding increase in worker productivity. And the blue line here is a measure of worker productivity for the full U.S. economy. It's up almost 40% since 1993. The red line is worker productivity in the construction industry, and it's effectively flat over the last 27 years. A little bit of gain, but not a lot. And that is one of the reasons that we haven't seen a lot of wage growth in the industry, which then creates a vicious circle or vicious cycle where that low wage growth then makes it more difficult to recruit people into the sector. So productivity is really a key challenge. And I do think 2022 and 2023 are going to be years where we see builders and remodelers really invest in innovation. Things like offsite construction, other ways to increase worker productivity in the sector, because we definitely need it in terms of wage growth. So that was kind of a deeper dive on labor. I gave you 5 L's. Let me kind of walk you through a few others. Lumber and materials. Residential construction materials right now are up 19% year over year in terms of the growth rate of those costs. You can see all the data here at the end of the slide. It is far outpacing what we saw over the last 2 decades. So it's gotten more expensive to acquire residential construction materials. And then more fundamentally, it's a little more difficult to measure. It's taking longer for those materials to arrive at the work site due to the supply chain issues. Things that used to have guaranteed delivery times of weeks are now taking months. I was in North Carolina a few weeks ago, and builders there were telling me that they were looking at 3 to 4 month waiting times on garage doors. Things that just go into building a house, and they're taking a lot longer. And the result is that they're having to tell their buyers they simply need to be patient as they wait for these building materials to arrive due to the supply chain issues that we see in the country. And we surveyed back in the spring, what were the top items that you saw shortages in terms from a builder perspective. I was surprised. I thought framing lumber was going to be at the top because that was the one where we saw the price growth. It was actually appliances. Every builder I know, apartment developer, single family builder, complains about microwaves that were produced in some part of Asia and are literally sitting in container ships off the port of Los Angeles. They know they've been manufactured, they know they've been shipped, and they're in some container box waiting to be deployed. So appliances have been at the top of the list for a while. And again, just look at the number and types of materials where at least half of home builders are reporting shortages. So the supply chain issue is a real thing. It's having an impact on price, but it's also having an impact on the timing of construction and how long it's taking to build these items. And the poster boy for some of this is really lumber. And you can look here. This is the price data on the lumber market. This is softwood lumber, so structural lumber used to make 2x4s and 2x6s. The blue line here is the price data. It was kind of averaging somewhere between $300 and $400 per 1,000 board feet. That's how we measure the price of lumber in this market. And then you can look at the April data of 2020, takes a little bit of a dip as we go into the COVID crisis. It then shoots up. It comes down at the end of the year. It's a little hard to explain exactly what happened there. I think buyers pulled back and then the price came down. Buyers, that is builders, came rushing back in. And then the pricing went up to $1,500 per thousand board feet. Just an incredible increase. It was easily adding at its peak $30,000 to a typical single family home and about $10,000 to a typical apartment. And then we got to a point where the buyers really went on strike when we got up to 1,500, and they just pulled back on quantity. It was too high, and the price dropped down to $390 or so. It's now rebounded to what I think is more of a sustainable range of about $500 to $700. But it was really lumber that was our first warning on some of the supply chain issues that the country faces right now. And the reasons for the price volatility in lumber, it's an exercise in economics 101. We have produced more lumber over the last year and a half. This is domestic sawmill output in the United States. But you can see back even in the fall of 2020, the September 2020 data, we were still producing less lumber in the United States than we were producing in 2016, which is just a striking statistic because the housing market has continued to grow. So it's trended in the right direction, but it is nowhere near where it needs to be. And the other thing to keep in mind is we get about 30% of the lumber that we used, and 95% of it is used in residential construction, so apartments and single-family homes. We get 30% from Canada. Now, that makes sense from a kind of a comparative advantage production, but even here, you see the imports from Canada, despite those price increases, have actually gone down over the last 5 years. The reason for that? Tariffs. A lot of people think that Canadian lumber is part of NAFTA, which we now call USMCA after it was renegotiated. But in fact, lumber is a completely separate trade dispute that we have with Canada. It dates back to all the way in the 1800s. And it has something to do with the fact that a lot of timber that's harvested in Canada is harvested off of government-owned or royal-owned land. They pay something called a stumpage fee. And the U.S. government and the U.S. domestic lumber industry maintain that that is a subsidized fee. It should be higher. The result is we have tariffs. Those tariffs were increased during the Trump administration. They're amazingly set to double here in the next few weeks from about a 9% tariff rate to an 18% rate. And so if I back it up, the reason that we've got all this volatility in pricing, insufficient domestic production, and then tariff policy that's limited our ability to import softwood lumber from Canada. And the result is higher housing costs and limited supply. So lumber is another one of those L's. Here's another, lot supplies. The lending market for land development is a lot tighter than it was 20 years ago. And these red bars that you see on this slide are the share of builders saying the lot supplies, in other words, developed land that's ready to be built on for a single family home. Those lot supplies are as low as they've been during the almost 25 years that we've done this survey. And that red bar you can see at the very end of the slide is approaching 80%. So we've got nearly 8 out of 10 home builders right now saying that lot supplies in their market are going to be low. And that's going to be a key constraint, particularly in the high growth markets this year. They're running out of lots. And so single family starts, construction activity was able to accelerate over the last year, but the land development pipeline really hasn't increased proportionally to that additional growth. And so in some markets, they're just going to run out of lots. And it takes 2 to 3 years to work from raw dirt as the regulatory approval goes through to developing it, adding the infrastructure, the roads and the sidewalks and all the other factors that are necessary to get built to ready to be built on by a home builder. And so lots are going to be a key factor. And then one of the other L's that I mentioned, laws and regulatory burdens. We do a study every 4 to 5 years of different kinds of costs. And I'm not saying these regulations are bad. I'm going to leave that, kind of for policy analysts. But we try to calculate in terms of things like all the costs necessary to get zoning approval, the cost of green space requirements, the cost that is paid by builders in terms of permit and impact fees. All these factors represent a gross cost in terms of they're just like, you need to pay for the wood, you need to pay for the land. And they represent, we believe, based on surveys of land developers and home builders, about 24% of the final price of a single family home. And that cost has gone up over the last 20 years. And right now represents about $94,000 in terms of gross costs when you add all these factors in. So these are getting built into the system. It's more expensive to build housing than it was 30 years ago. And again, this is another reason that we've got a housing deficit. And this is kind of the complement to that the prior slide was single family housing. This is multifamily housing. This is joint research that we did with the National Multifamily Housing Council, and the regulatory cost was even higher for apartments. And I think this intuitively makes sense. It's almost a third of a typical apartment's final gross costs. And the reason for that, you're building in higher density, more brownfield development, higher regulatory costs, higher taxes. And so it's even more difficult from a regulatory perspective to build those apartments. And one of the things that we like to say is, if we want to build more apartments, we can do things like reducing parking requirements. We should be building apartments, not parking spaces. And those challenges really do manifest themselves in terms of insufficient supply when it comes to the multifamily space. A couple of final demographic items before I give you our outlook and take some questions. I've mentioned this a few times. This is one way of looking at it. It's not a complete story, but I think it's an interesting stat. If we look back across decades and look at the number of single family homes that we've built by decade, and then we're looking here at per million population in the US. So, we probably should be looking at that in terms of population growth or household formation growth, but just adjusting the number of single family homes that are built by millions of population in the United States. What you can see is in the 80s, the 90s, and the early 2000s, we were building about 41,000 single family homes per year per million population in the US, even with business cycle effects and changes in interest rates. And then over the last decade, in the 2010s or the 20-teens or whatever we're calling this decade, that rate of production really fell off. So there's a pretty healthy debate right now over how big the housing deficit is. My peer group at the Realtors says 5 to 8 million homes. Freddie Mac has an estimate out saying 3.8 million in terms of the single family housing deficit. My team has a smaller estimate. We think it's about 1 million, and we use vacancy rates from census data, including the American Community Survey, to calculate that. But we also include how many ADUs have been built over the last decade. We think that's about 1.5 million. So we're pretty close to the Freddie Mac estimate, but we're also counting ADUs as housing units, and the result is a lingering housing deficit of about 1 million units. But that's still enough that that there's a lot of unmet demand. And the reason for that unmet demand is demographics. You've probably seen some version of a slide like this, whether in academic research or among economists, but it's population profile of the US. On the bottom part of the slide is age. The vertical axis is a count of people. And I've divided it up into the generational boxes from Gen Alpha, Gen Z, and then look at the millennial box. They're the largest generational group out there. They're entering, the leading edge is 42, but the bulk of the population's they're in their early 30s, prime first-time home buying years. So the demand for single-family homes is going up. And some of the demand weakness that we saw in the prior decade was due to the fact that my Gen X is a smaller generational group, but Gen X is going to be the primary buyers of new construction as they reach their 40s and 50s. So the demographic support for single family housing is pretty strong right now. And then if you're a doom and gloom type person, look at Gen Z, the younger members of Gen Z, look at Gen Alpha. We've had some of the lowest birth rates on record in the United States. That's going to have an impact on the apartment market probably about 10 or 15 years from now. Now, I know builders right now who are already planning for that drop off in demographic demand, who are getting more cautious about ownership of long-term rental properties just because of the simple demographics that we see. All right, so I'm going to show you then our forecast and some of the outlook data, and I'm happy to take some questions. First, this is the NAHB Wells Fargo Housing Market Index. The November version of this comes out tomorrow at 10 a.m. It's usually covered live on CNBC. The reading last month was a level of 80. It's a 0 to 100 point scale where anything above 50 indicates that the single family market is expanding. And we statistically design it and build it so it predicts single family starts, which is the red line here. And you can see these two series move fairly well together. So when we take that HMI, which is one of our important forecast variables, and plug it into the model, here's what we get. And the blue line here is single family starts. And you can see after the Great Recession from roughly 2011 up until 2020, we had this kind of modest growth path. And it's worth noting that every year since the Great Recession, we've been underbuilding. We've built fewer homes than in every single year of the 1990s. So that's again what we were trying to explain with that supply side headwind hypothesis. Now, if you look at the 2020 data, you can see a drop in the spring, an unsustainably strong rebound during the second half of 2020. That caused lumber prices to go up and all that growth in wages that I showed you for the residential industry. And then our forecast model kind of wants us to get back to that long run trend. So the result is I've got a little more bearish forecast than a lot of people in the housing industry. We've got single family starts flat in 22 and 2023. And the reason for that, the supply side constraints combined with higher interest rates, which is going to reduce the amount of home construction as we move forward. Now, it's worth noting, even though we've got it flat, the levels that are represented there are still 25% higher than 2019. So everything has kind of taken a shift up. In terms of the geography, we do something called the Home Building Geography Index, where we take the county level data and we essentially pour it into buckets of similar geographic areas. So all the counties in blue here represent roughly, this is kind of a proxy, but roughly core counties of large MSAs with a more than 1 million population. And when we do that, all these areas in aggregate were growing at about a 26% growth rate over the last 4 quarters. Now, one of the hypotheses, and I think it's correct, is that as a result of COVID, we saw a shift out in housing demand. In other words, within metropolitan areas, demand shifted out because of hybrid work models, cost concerns, and in some cases, the desire to get out of high population density areas. Well, on this next slide, we've got roughly the suburbs of those large MSAs that I showed you before. And if you look on this slide, these areas over the last 4 quarters were growing in terms of single family home building at a 31% growth rate. So 26% growth rate for the cores, 31% growth rate for the suburbs. And if I take one more step out to kind of the exurban type counties, 36% growth rate. So those growth rates quarter by quarter have been narrowing as some of that suburban shift eases, but it was measurable in terms of construction permit data that we saw this shift out. I do think it's coming back in. And in fact, in the second quarter of 2021, we had the best quarter for townhouse construction starts in 14 years. So it was a rebound for that kind of medium density inner suburb development. Moving from single family to remodeling, 2021, we're expecting more than a 10% growth rate for the year when all the data come in. And we think that's going to slow as well. A lot of remodeling activity is connected to the volume of existing home sales. And as interest rates rise, the amount of refi, mortgage activity declines, the remodeling market's going to slow, but it's still going to grow. And the reason why is we have an aging housing stock that needs a lot more investment. And then lastly, multifamily construction. This year, really strong growth rate. The multifamily market's rebounding now. It's following the single family market with a lag of about 6 to 8 months. So we're looking at almost a 19% gain in terms of multifamily construction. And then we think for 22 and 2023, we're kind of leveling off at about 440,000 units per year. And in green, I put kind of the disappointing data. A lot of this growth, a lot of the rebound is really concentrated in larger properties. That missing middle, the 2 to 4 unit, it's only up 3% year to date. So we've still got more work to do when it comes to things like zoning laws and trying to incentivize that missing middle production, which I think almost everyone agrees we don't have enough of. And then lastly, that acceleration of single family activity, if you look at it side by side with multifamily construction, something significant happened in terms of the construction pipeline in early fall of this year. The red line here is multifamily units under production, so currently actively being built. And since 2013, we had more apartments being built than single family homes. And due to that acceleration during the second half of 2020, when it came to single family starts, the blue line got just ever so above the red line for the first time in 8 years. I think these two numbers are probably going to track each other as multifamily construction continues to surge. But it was kind of an interesting kind of moment where the gap between these two items really closed up as a result of the COVID crisis. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending today. I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have, both from what NAHB does and is, or some of the concepts that we walked you through here today. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Harvey.
Okay, thanks a lot, Robert. That was a great talk, chock full of information and facts, very well presented, very clear. Appreciate that. I have a few questions, and I'll turn it over to Jerica, who will field questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to that by the end of the hour. You talked a lot about the labor shortage, and you talked about the flat wages in construction. And you mentioned that needs to be connected. In order to increase wages, we need growth. We need to increase productivity growth. But that seems really hard in home building. I mean, is 3D printing a solution? How do we increase productivity?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I'll give talks to builders and, I'll go through my numbers and my data analysis and challenge them. And then they kind of look at me like, easy for you to say, data boy. Yeah, look, there are some ways that we can raise worker productivity in the sector. Offsite construction has been cited as one, but my concern about offsite construction, this is modular, where you're building most of the home in a factory. It includes panelized construction where you're building the frames of the home in the factory and then assembling them at the work site. And it includes, by the way, the third component, which I didn't present data for, which is manufactured housing, what we used to call mobile homes. The concern is that if you look at the market share for modular and panelized, it's about 3% of single family starts. In the late 90s, when I was still at Ohio State, it was 7 to 8%. So the market share has come down. But what you're seeing is a lot of investment by the big national builders, particularly in some of the high growth markets, high cost markets, places like California and Phoenix, to do more modular. So there's an attempt to do some economies of scale. The other ways that we can get worker productivity, this is harder to measure, but I believe it in my heart, diversity of the workforce. I think when you bring in people that have new ideas and new perspectives and you open up conversation, you get innovation. So that's a kind of a cultural change. And then just, investing in technology at the work site, better tools, more efficient timing. Obviously the supply chain issues are a challenge right now, but like you said, it's easier said than done. I think it's coming. I think 3D printing might be a little bit exaggerated, but we're going to see some more emphasis on those kinds of new ways to build housing over the next 2 to 3 years, because we're going to have to, because of higher costs.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned the role of investors in some of these markets, and then there's a lot of construction. I've been reading about the construction of single family housing built for rentals crowding out owner-occupied housing. What's your take on that? How big is that in different markets?
Yeah, so this is obviously in the media a lot. Now, just in terms of the data, single family built for rent. So this is a home builder building a home and then keeping it himself. He's not going to sell it. He's going to rent it out. It represents about 4.5% of single family starts. It's a little bit elevated. A few decades ago, the historical norm for it was about 2.8%. So the share is higher. But what we've seen really growth in is the next kind of arm's length away, which is the investor buying a home. So it shows up as a new home sale, but that investor is not going to live in it. They're going to rent it. And we think that might be anywhere between 3 and 5% of single family starts. So that number is going up. It can be exaggerated. I've seen some stats in the Wall Street Journal saying it's 20% of the home building market. Not true, but we are seeing that growth. And the reason why? All that home price growth, that was great for homeowners in terms of home equity wealth, but it really makes that down payment constraint on buying a home a lot tighter. And so there are people who want a single family home, but they're going to have to rent it. And I'll tell you, in DC, there's a big debate right now that's brewing. It's going to come out more in 2022. There are some people who believe those investors are crowding out prospective home buyers, and they want to do something about it. So watch for probably some good ideas and some bad ideas coming about in the debate in 2022 on the single family rental sector.
Okay. And I have one kind of combined question that touches upon laws and lots. And after I ask this question, I'm going to turn it over to Jerica to field some of the audience questions. But you mentioned, zoning and land use controls, and that's affecting the housing affordability crisis. And related to that, we see some of this in Columbus, the role of people who say, not my backyard, NIMBYism. So tell me about that. Do you have any examples of markets or cities where they're addressing, zoning controls, reforming? That's actually a debate here in Columbus about, reformulating our zoning laws. And how do we do that, and how do we fight back against resistance to greater density in city centers?
Yeah, this is one of those areas where I think there is a bipartisan agreement. I think everyone, right and left, kind of agrees that exclusionary zoning requiring to use too much land that hurts density, hurts the ability of builders to build housing supply is a bad result. And Ed Glazer, the housing economist at Harvard, has said that no single regulatory policy has as much sort of deadweight loss on the welfare of Americans as some of our zoning rules. So the examples, I know, Harvey, I know you follow this, but things like Minneapolis have made some changes. The whole state of Oregon has got by right doing 2 to 4 unit housing on single family lots. Anchorage, Alaska, I was there in Anchorage at the end of September. They can do that within the metro area. They take a single family lot and now subdivide it into 2. It's not a silver bullet, though. It's not a sufficient condition to get additional supply and get density. There's a lot of other things that need to be changed, which is, again, why we use that 5 L's formulation. These things, we need to make progress on all of them. And my concern is if you look at some of the areas where they've made the right move on zoning, you don't see a lot of growth in housing supply yet. And Minneapolis, unfortunately, is one of those areas. So let's wait for some of the data, but I think we're headed in the right direction in some of those areas. My hope would be we see more townhouse construction. Townhouses make up about 13% of single family starts. They probably should be somewhere between 15 and 20. I think we'll get there over the next 5 years or so.
And that's the missing middle that you talked about previously.
Townhouses are still technically single family because they've got a front door, you just share a wall. So they're the census and us count them as single family. But that 2 to 4 unit, duplexes, triplexes, where you've got an owner occupier and maybe a rental tenant, we need to build more of that. We used to build a lot of that in the United States. We don't build as much. And it's a great way to keep kind of the feel of a neighborhood, but add additional housing units. Again, just like in multifamily, we need to be building more apartments and fewer parking spaces. We need to be building more homes, including single family homes. And the way to do that is to reduce some of the zoning rules that require too much land to not be built on.
Can't disagree with you there. Okay, I'm going to turn over to Jerica now, who's going to field some of the audience questions. Jerica, please.
Yeah, so for our first question, it comes from Ethan. It's with the estimation of a housing deficit, you're about 1 million and up to nearly 8 million. Is there consideration for the need of diverse housing options for households of various income levels and their need for appropriately priced houses?
Yeah, this is a key question. It's one thing to just throw out a stock number, and that stock number, by the way, I recognize that range is huge, right? Between 8 million and 1 million. It's based on different assumptions. One of the big things, and this gets to kind of the diversity. Let's think about diversity here in terms of age. If you look at the census data, the share of young adults, 25 to 34-year-olds, who live with their parents, that share has doubled over the last 2 decades. It used to be about 12% of individuals in that age class. It's now more than 20%. So when you're making a housing deficit estimate, do you assume that's the new normal, or do you assume some of those need to be unlocked with additional housing supply? That's where some of the differences come. But I think you're getting to kind of some broader issues with the question, which is, where are we not building enough for communities? So communities that have traditionally not had access to home ownership. That's a lending challenge. You've got to get banks to be able to lend to land developers in markets to be able to provide that opportunity for home to purchase. Entry level construction is the hardest for builders to build to. So, if you think about part of the market that's reasonably well supplied, where there's no housing deficit, it's homes that are more than 3,000 square feet. It's easier to get financing to build those kinds of homes, and it's easier to build them. It's the 1,800 to 2,100 square foot entry-level single-family home in a market that traditionally hasn't gotten as much attention from the banks that's the most difficult to build. And that's places where we could get policy help from governments to be able to say, here we're going to provide some incentives, whether it's lower impact fees or faster approval to provide housing supply in those communities. That's where the real challenge is.
Perfect, thank you. So for our next question, it says, hi, Rob, welcome back to Kira. Thanks for the talk. On the demand side, how much of a concern is the increased impact of natural disasters leading to the need to replace housing stock due to wildfires and storms? Or is it just that, or is it just rounding error on the national scale?
That's an excellent question. And so, I was going to do the traditional on the one hand, on the other hand, two-handed economist. I mean, yeah, the numbers are small, but let's put small into context. We estimate that probably about 200,000 to 250,000 homes a year are rebuilds, built from a fire or a natural disaster. And without a doubt, if you look at things like the CoreLogic data, and they're the folks that produce the Case-Shiller Index, the number of homes that are at risk from flooding, climate change, wildfires getting attention really now over the last few years, that share of the stock is going up. I will tell you, my industry has a lot of internal debate about this. What do you do about flood insurance? Flood insurance exists because of government programs. When there's something called risk rating 2.0, where FEMA has adjusted the flood insurance rates, and the result is people in coastal markets are going to pay a lot more over the last 5-10 years for flood insurance. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? In the long run, it might be a good thing, in terms of changes the geography of home construction. In the short run, it could be a bad thing because people who own housing, who don't have cash resources, suddenly may be forced to sell because they can't pay for the insurance. And you can have the same kind of discussions about things like wildfire risk. I think the big thing here is this is an area where data can play a huge role over the next 10 years. So if you're into real estate development or real estate analysis, the ability to do really detailed geographic data analysis is going to be key of that debate. And I think that's going to play out for the next 5-10 years.
Great, thank you. So our next question comes from Katie on the issue of the lot supply. Where will more empty lots properties come from? Does the city play a role in securing space for residential development?
Yeah, so there's kind of two areas where a lot of home building takes place. There's kind of the more traditional infill, smaller builders coming in and putting up, a few homes, a few townhomes. By the way, we're going to see a lot of redevelopment activity in that infill where commercial office and retail goes vacant. And then is redeveloped into much needed housing supply. So that's going to be closer into the urban core. And then there's traditional large community development. That's typically where farming comes about. When I first started hearing the question, though, I wasn't thinking within metropolitan area. You were saying, where is this additional land going to come from? And I was going to give the glib answer of Texas. I mean, if you look at 3 of the top 5 home building markets right now are Dallas, Houston, and Austin. And in fact, if you add together Dallas and Houston alone in terms of single family home building, and anyone that remembers the 80s or 90s should be just struck by this stat, Dallas and Houston combined are building, I think, 30% more housing than the entire state of California. Those 2 metros. So that is function of both how much easier it is to build in Texas and how difficult it's built in California. The last part of that question is, what role can government provide? Just making the process more efficient, but in some cases, land banking. I was in Fargo, North Dakota a few weeks ago. They've got a new kind of land banking system that's going to provide additional land that's ready to build for workforce development housing, which I thought was a great program. So there is definitely a role to play when it comes to government, when it comes to land development, because government is already involved in those markets.
Okay, thanks. We're at the top of the hour, so I think we'll wrap things up at this point. Robert, thank you so much, and welcome back to Cura. Good to see one of our previous GRAs doing so well. Keep up the good work. Only wish you could have been here in person, but perhaps sometime in the future.
In the future,
Okay.
yes.
Yes, and I want to thank the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, MORPC, who was our partner in this event, part of their affordable housing series. And again, stay tuned, cura.osu.edu, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We'll be having back to our regular schedule event starting in spring 2022, and we hope to see you there. Bye, everyone. Have a good day. Thank you again, Robert.